am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs, where I interview David Treleaven, a PhD and educator, writer, and somatic therapist working in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is the author of TraumaSensitive Mindfulness, Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing. In 2019, I was able to interview David at Wisdom 2.0 Live to talk about his perspective on trauma when practicing mindfulness. During this interview, you'll gain an understanding of how you can be more sensitive and aware to what people do versus what they say, and how you can support them in the workplace. And definitely stay tuned for our B3 breaks that are also offered through this podcast so you can start putting these mindfulness practices in place. Hi, I'm here with David Treleaven at the Wisdom 2.0 conference, and he has done a book on trauma-sensitive mindfulness and how when we get back to our trauma through meditation and mindfulness, how when we help ourselves, we help others. And I'm happy to have him today. If you want to talk a little bit about yourself first, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Canada, grew up in Toronto. So from Toronto, been living in the US for a while, and my main work is around where does mindfulness meditation help people who are struggling with trauma or struggling with an overwhelming negative experience, and where could it possibly hinder them? And so in my research, it's finding that some people really benefit from doing mindfulness meditation. Actually, most people will. And then there'll be this small number of people that will actually run into trouble. Mm-hmm. And so how can we, as people who are offering mindfulness instruction, how do we do that well, and what are the best practices that we can apply in order to make sure that no one's basically falling through the cracks?
Yeah, so a lot of times we don't talk about this in the workplace, and those of us that are running businesses and dealing with employee engagement, but a lot of sometimes the underlying cause of employees kind of going off the rails can be their trauma that is their inner work to do. Do you have any suggestions for companies that, may not realize that it's kind of like, the Band-Aid, rip the Band-Aid off, what's actually under there that's creating more of the issue?
I think that's the main thing I'd say to people who are implementing mindfulness programs in business is at a base level, don't assume that it's going to work for everyone all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, mindfulness has a really great reputation, and for really good reason around research. And there's emerging research that says, hey, there's going to be 5-10% of people who might end up having difficult experiences. So I think that's just an entry level point, is just have expectations, try to temper your expectations and watch out for anyone who's running into trouble, doesn't come back to the groups, because we don't want to lose them and have that, the cost of that can be high.
Right, and I think it's such an important point that those people that might drop out could experience the least amount of engagement in the company because they don't want to handle what's ever going on for them. So, it's a way of self-identification, but what kind of tips, so if those people tapped out of a mindfulness program that you put in the business, what kind of suggestions would you have to help them in their journey?
So the most practical thing that business owners can do when they're implementing these programs is actually to have some sort of check and balance around tracking people, and especially if they leave. So I've worked with business owners who said, how can I basically monitor that people are doing okay if they choose to opt out of the program? Mm-hmm. And as long as there's some basic protocol, like a follow-up email, or at least we're tracking attendance, because basically people assume, if they left, maybe they just didn't like it, but it could be that something came up that was difficult for them, and it's helpful to have just a one-to-one conversation. So a quick story is, I was working with a business, someone who had lost their mother, it was kind of a traumatic loss for them. They did the meditation, it just felt like too much for them.
Right.
And no one checked in with her about why she didn't come back. They just assumed, oh, I guess she didn't like the meditation. But she was actually really drowning in some hard feelings. And she said, if I had had a one-to-one conversation, if someone had emailed me or my manager had checked in, it would have felt so much better for me personally and in the company.
Yeah.
So it's like, just be tracking people, and I'd say that's the main instruction.
I think it's such a good thing to talk about, because you might put this program in place and someone might rate it down for reasons that you don't even realize why, when you put the survey out to the employees, and then you're not going one level deeper of what's working, what's not working, where can we put some coaches in and possibly help people in the way that work for them more privately.
Absolutely. I was doing some work, I was working with a couple different companies who there was a lot of pressure on the person bringing in the meditation program about the basically the feedback that they were getting, and they had scores that they had to meet.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we found bumped the scores up is if there was actually some tracking that was happening. Pre-post survey, we knew we were going to have a conversation with you at the beginning and end.
Right.
That actually really helped with engagement, and actually bumped the scores up, which is really important for a bottom line.
Yeah, and it's important for organizations that if you're the team trying to push it in the organization, those metrics do matter. And so how can you help, improve it?
Totally.
So just switching gears, because, business owners, C-level executives, someone might be coming to them saying, this is something our business could really use. I've read stuff that this really helps the company overall, from a profitability, level, employee engagement. However, they might just, have the idea of like, okay, do whatever you want. With a lot of the research, if the C-levels, if the owners are not practicing themselves, you're not leading by example. So what would be some suggestions as far as from an owner leadership perspective of how you get involved with this?
Yeah, when I talk to C-level folks, my recommendation is at least to try the program before they actually offer it to employees, because if they don't know it, if they haven't practiced it, it doesn't bring credibility inside the company, but also we want them to know the terrain that they're asking people into. So it's kind of an expected answer, but at least have your own practice and experience with it before you're just kind of jumping in and offering it to your whole company.
Yeah. Have you seen anything with the leadership teams that you've worked with where it's kind of thwarted the program or it's been a struggle for them?
I think the one time I saw it was when there was an executive team meeting, they had implemented mindfulness meditation practices in, and then it was clear that the person who was the CEO actually hadn't been doing any of the practices. And someone said, well, what do you think of this practice and how should we do this? And you could tell that the person didn't have the ground to answer the question. So it's more that it broke trust inside the company.
Yeah.
And so again, I think it's like if you're going to actually bring mindfulness programs in, know why it would benefit people and have personal examples that you can give about why this is useful and helpful.
And even what you struggled with.
Exactly.
Like when you actually can break down as a leader and say, look, this was hard for me too.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing this result. I think it's important. So anything else you want to offer up as far as ideas or information for people about this topic?
The one other thing I want to say is just, even though I'm doing work and research around meditation, mindfulness, and trauma, that I want people to know in no way am I saying that something bad's going to happen or that any kind of fear-mongering about, meditation's bad. That's not, I want to be clear because some people can think I'm going down that road. It's more to say it's an amazing practice, especially inside of companies. Let's just actually have a wide view of the range of experiences that can happen, and that we're all more powerful when we do that. So it's not a bad practice, and we want to be cautious.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
And now for a mindful moment on my interview with David and his book about trauma-sensitive mindfulness. I think a lot of times we talk about mindfulness as a one-size-fits-all and how therapeutic it can be, which it definitely is, because what it does is create awareness for us. And that's why I have such a focus on this in the last few episodes of talking about how to incorporate this into the workplace and how programs can work and not work when mindfulness programs are put into place. And what David was talking about during this interview, which I think is really important, is that with mindfulness, we become more aware, that's what it's supposed to do, and observe how we're feeling, what's going on in our bodies, thoughts, and sometimes things that we push down come up for us because we're silent or because we give ourselves that space to just observe what's going on for us, which can definitely be uncomfortable. I always use the example with owning a yoga studio is that people will come into yoga with a lot of excuses about why they can't do yoga, or maybe they're not flexible or so forth. But what ends up happening is they're more afraid to go to yoga than something like CrossFit, because in yoga, you're alone with your mind. And sometimes we run from our mind. And when we start putting mindfulness programs in the workplace that people can start attending, things come up for us that maybe we aren't aware that's there. And his focus is very much on the things that come up for us that might hurt, that might be painful, that might be traumatic. And rather than passing judgment on someone that might tap out of a program or walk away, or when you're doing a meditation, they don't close their eyes, they're fiddling around or not wanting to be a part of it, really understanding and going that next step one-on-one with that person, asking what was going on for them. Not just assuming that they just don't like it or don't want to be a part of it or so forth, but it's that extra step of showing that you care. And that's what becomes so important in the workplace, is that we nurture people rather than just trying to push everyone into the same round hole, that doesn't necessarily work if you're a square peg and things are coming up for you that you don't want to come up for you in the workplace. So what kind of pathways would you determine that that person could go to if something comes up? And I think this discussion, it becomes more and more important as mental health has really surfaced over the last year as an issue for people with their work and with their home life and everything that we've gone through, is that you have other pathways. And that's why it's so important to have employee assistance programs that are anonymous, and recommend, if someone needs someone to talk to, that they do go to a therapist. And I do think there is a line between coaches and therapists. Therapists go to school to handle someone that is dealing with something very traumatic. The thing about mindfulness practices and yoga and other philosophies similar to that is, because we allow that space, things come up for us. But it doesn't mean that coach has the training and the ability to handle what comes up for a person. They can be present for the person. They can create the space for that person to share. But they aren't a doctor. Some are doctors, but many aren't, and that run these programs, that they're trained as mindfulness coaches. And so it's important, if you put these pathways in your workplace that are so important for people in helping them to feel healthier internally, not just physically, but internally, that you do have these pathways available for people as things come up for them. Because, when we're sitting in the muck of what comes up for us, sometimes we pass judgment on ourselves or get hard on ourselves instead of realizing that we're supported and nurtured, and that what we're going through is similar paths to other people. It might not be the similar experience, but similar from the way that it feels in our bodies. And there are people that are trained that can help us on that path. So never feel like it's a weakness to ask for help, and never feel like it's a weakness or that there's an inhibitor to you asking someone if they need help, because that is what mindfulness is. It's not only being aware of ourselves, but being aware of others and what they may need, and not making assumptions, not creating stories, but actually being present for them, being compassionate for them and their experience at that present moment, and finding the path that is right for them. thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.